Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's EDI Policy and Training Seminar. This is the third in Fasken's four-part webinar series on EDI issues. My name's Shane Todd. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the co-chair of Fasken's National Labor, Employment, and Human Rights Group, and I'm a partner in the Toronto office. Here at Fasken, we've embarked on a journey of reconciliation guided by our Reconciliation Action Plan. As part of this journey, we believe it's important to acknowledge the land and the people who have called this land home since time immemorial. Today, I'm in Toronto, territory that's been home to many nations, including the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13. We appreciate the opportunity to live and work here. We recognize the importance of working to advance reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here and across Canada. There are a few housekeeping matters before we begin. Please take a moment to review the information slide that's on your screen now. I'd like in particular to draw your attention to the survey point. We really value your feedback on our sessions, and we encourage you to fill in the survey before you log out of the webinar today. The results help us plan our future seminars, and if there are topics of interest to you, we want to hear about them. We have an automated process now for those who require Ontario and Quebec CPD certificates. At the end of the webinar, a QR code will appear on your screen, and a link will be added to the audience chat. You can scan the QR code, and that will allow you to receive a certificate once you provide us with some information. For those of you who aren't able to complete this process today, certificates will be sent next week. Now, with the housekeeping matters out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Joining me today are Terry Kyle Lapierre, a partner in our Quebec City office. Terry Kyle, or TK, to those who know him well, is known in the field for his top-level professional excellence and takes pride in providing clients with strategic legal advice based on a holistic approach. TK's reputation for responsiveness and innovative solutions earned him a distinction of one to watch in 2022 by Best Lawyers Canada. Also joining us is Naya Dhatt, an associate in our Vancouver office. Naya assists employers in preventing and resolving workplace disputes. She has a passion for labor and employment human rights issues that stems from her prior experience as a small business owner. Naya has a really personal understanding of the day-to-day challenges facing employers and works to provide practical, effective, and efficient solutions to workplace issues. As you'll see on the screen, we've got a really full agenda today. I'm not going to review the agenda for you, it's on the screen, and I'm going to turn things over to Naya to start us off with our first topic. Naya.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here today. I'm going to be talking to you first about how policies and training contribute to workplace EDI. So firstly, we'll talk about why EDI policies and trainings are important. And this is it's good to think about this so that you understand and can help others understand, stakeholders understand why your organization's investment in EDI is important. Firstly, EDI in the workplace is becoming the norm, and people are expecting to see that that employers are taking action on this point and that they have plans to improve. You also have certain legal obligations that require you to have EDI policies and trainings in place, or that if you have these policies and trainings in place, it'll help you to meet certain obligations. So some training is legally mandated, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And human rights tribunals can order certain training and EDI action where, in the context of a complaint, an employer is found to have discriminated contrary to the Human Rights Code. There's also a trend towards more legislation promoting EDI in the workplace. One example is BC's Pay Transparency Act, which, if you'd like to learn more about, we do have an upcoming webinar on November the 5th that I will be presenting at. But this legislation is aimed at reducing the gender pay gap and requires employers to prepare pay transparency reports that report publicly on what the gender pay gap is in their organizations. And employers are also required to post salary and wage information on public job postings. Another reason to care about EDI policies and training is that if there is an incident of bullying, harassment, or discrimination in your workplace, you are going to be asked what policies and trainings you had in place to prevent that situation. So the impact of EDI policies and training is that your employees will understand better what they can and can't do in the workplace, and that in turn should help you to prevent instances of discrimination, bullying, and harassment. And that is important because the workplace investigations, defending against various human rights complaints, occupational health and safety complaints, and civil suits can become quite expensive and time-consuming. And then the other kind of reasons to care about this is that employees do feel more respected and supported and feel more able to be engaged in the workplace, more productive when they know that they can feel safe in the context of their workplace. And it can build stronger teams. It can foster understanding between your employees about the various differences and in people that work in your workplace. So there are certain policies and trainings required by law in Canada, and we'll get into some of those in a second. But the first thing to understand is that the Supreme Court of Canada has said that employers have a responsibility to ensure that their workplace is free of discrimination. So even if your jurisdiction does not have any specific mandatory training requirements or policy requirements, there is an understanding that employers are generally required to implement and maintain appropriate policies and procedures to respond properly to workplace complaints. So I'll start first with the jurisdictions of BC and Ontario. I've looped these together because they're quite similar. The Workers' Compensation Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. In BC, you're required to have a bullying and harassment policy, and in Ontario, you're required to have a workplace violence and harassment policy and the programs to implement them, and you have to review them as often as necessary, but at least on an annual basis. In BC, employers are also required to provide training on prevention of bullying and harassment prior to a worker starting in your workplace. And in Ontario, you're required to provide certain information and instruction about workplace violence and harassment policies and programs. And under the Human Rights Code in both jurisdictions, there's no specific policy or training requirements, but as we saw, there is a general requirement for employers to have a workplace free of discrimination, and the tribunal can order certain policies or training in the context of a complaint as a remedy. In Ontario, there's also certain accessibility requirements. Employers need to create policies to achieve certain accessibility goals and to train employees and volunteers on those. And there's also pay equity requirements. Depending on the size of your organization, you may have to create a written plan for pay equity. In Quebec, there's the Act Respecting Labor Standards that requires a psychological and sexual harassment prevention and complaint processing policy. And you've also got to have a workplace violence and harassment prevention program that includes an offer of training. And under the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms in Quebec, again, like BC and Ontario, there's no specific training that is required or a specific policy that's required. But the tribunal does have the power to order training or to order policy implementation in the event that the employer is found to have discriminated. And there's also the Pay Equity Act, which requires training for employees who are going to be participating in the employer's Pay Equity Committee. And federally, under the Canada Labour Code, you are required to develop certain workplace harassment and violence prevention policies. And you're required to develop and identify training on workplace harassment and violence that is particular to the circumstances of your workplace. And under the Human Rights Act, again, like BC, Ontario, and Quebec, there's no specific policy or training requirement, but the tribunal does have the power to require that you implement certain policies or training as a remedy to prevent certain discriminatory practices. There's also the Employment Equity Act. Employers are covered employers who are covered by legislated employment equity program have to prepare, implement, and revise an equity plan for designated groups. There are 4 designated groups under the Employment Equity Act. Those are women, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and visible minorities. Okay. Now on to our next section here. We're going to be talking about some of the common issues, pitfalls that we see in EDI practices, and later we'll speak to you about how to prevent those and implement best practices. So the common things that we see in employer EDI practices is not having any policies or training at all, having policies but not having training, or not keeping records of the things that you're doing on the policies and the training, or creating policies, creating training without actually consulting with the stakeholders in your organization who may be able to contribute to creating more effective policies and training, and who really should be consulted when creating these. Another big one, and this is kind of, I'd say, the biggest one that I see, is setting and forgetting. So it's when you do the work to develop certain policies, you do some training, but then you don't actually update the policy or implement the policy. No one's quite sure what it says, and it's just not the point of having the policy or the training kind of evaporates at that point. Another one is not evaluating the progress of having the policies or the training so that you can improve on that over time. Another one is not making policies easily acceptable to your employees and to management so that people don't know what they say. Another one is that they're not taken seriously. And this is a really important point here. Your employees are only going to take your training and policies as seriously as management takes them. So there needs to be a top-down commitment to these EDI practices. Training and policies at the start of employment only is another one we see. It's important to consider offering refresher training and to review and update policies and trainings over time, especially in response to incidents. So we were talking earlier about the fact that human rights tribunals do have the ability to order certain training and EDI action in the context of a complaint as a remedy. And we're going to be taking a look at some examples here. Federally, one of the examples is in Young and Via Rail, Canada. This is a fairly recent Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case where the tribunal ordered Via Rail to develop human rights and anti-harassment policies and procedures in consultation with the Human Rights Commission, and to hire an external expert to train all employees and management on those policies and procedures. We've also got 2 examples here in Quebec. In the first one, the tribunal found that the dismissal of an employee due to reaction to racist jokes was discriminatory. There was an order to implement a policy against discrimination, specifically responsive to the anti-discrimination obligations in the charter, and to include the prohibition of dismissal due to race or to color, which are prohibited grounds under the legislation. And there was a requirement to ensure a respectful workplace. There were also damages of $10,000 awarded in that situation. In the second case, again, the tribunal ordered, in this case, it was 2 police officers who had acted in a discriminatory manner, and the tribunal ordered their employer, who was the city, to provide training led by a person qualified in discrimination in racial profiling, to provide that training to current and future police officers and staff. In BC, there's 3 examples here. The first one is in LeBlanc. The tribunal ordered the employer to participate in harassment awareness and sensitivity training, and that was in response to a complaint of sexual harassment in the workplace. And the employer was also required to provide proof of completion. In the second one, the tribunal found so in this case, the employer already had a policy to prevent harassment in the workplace, but there was still an incident of racial harassment. So the tribunal said there was no reason to implement a new policy, but the employer needed to retrain employees on that policy and to review that policy because there was evidence that it was not being taken seriously. In McCluskey and London Drugs, this was an instance where a store manager was sexually harassing one of the employees. And in this case, actually, the employer was successful in having the complaint dismissed because they took appropriate steps in the circumstances. They had the proper policies and procedures in place. They investigated the situation, and they moved the offending employee to a different store and required them to complete training. So that's an example of how, if you do have the proper policies and procedures in place, you're implementing them properly, that you can avoid, difficult situations at the Human Rights Tribunal in the future. So in Ontario, I've got two examples here. The first is SR in Matthews Hall. This was another instance of discrimination on the basis of race. And the tribunal ordered here for the school to hire an independent expert in human rights and EDI to do a human rights audit and provide in-depth training to the school's board, administrators, teachers, and staff. And the second one in Lewis and Sugar Daddy's nightclub, there were $15,000 in damages, plus in order to provide training to all staff on the issues of gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And this complaint, the person who was complaining was a trans person who was discriminated against. Now I will hand it over to my colleague TK to talk about best practices in EDI.
Thanks, Naya. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My pronouns are he, him. Before we get into policies and trainings as best practices, just a few comments on compliance versus best practices. Compliance essentially is the adherence to the minimum requirements, and some will say it's with a view to avoiding liability, like in the cases that Naya just described. But employers who seek to implement best practices need to go beyond strict compliance and actually look for opportunities to generate meaningful and lasting impact on organizational culture. So as employers, we have the responsibility to recognize the challenges faced by marginalized groups and then take appropriate measures to provide safe and inclusive environments. And there may be a legal requirement to ensure the safety of your employees, but how you operationalize that process is what's going to make the difference between simply checking the box and going beyond with an authentic commitment to embark on the journey towards EDI. And that's where results are going to be produced. So let's start with the basics on how to avoid the common pitfalls that were described earlier by Naya. So enact policies is one thing, but make sure that you follow up on their implementation. So don't just go through the motions of enacting a policy for the sake of compliance and then sticking them on a shelf. Make sure the policies are actually being followed by employees in your organization. At minimum, employees need to know about them. They need to understand the significance of the policy, how to utilize it, and have easy access to them. And unfortunately, we're often consulted by employers who fail to follow their own policies and procedures, often because of a lack of training and awareness. For example, employers faced with litigation due to mismanagement of allegations of harassment in the workplace will sometimes say, well, there was no formal complaint, so we didn't do anything. But ultimately, policies need to provide for diligent action to put an end to potential harassment or discrimination in the workplace. And if you don't follow your own procedures as an employer, you will be ill-equipped to deal with litigation. Now, name champions who are going to take ownership of the policies. These are crucial, and these people are going to be able to assist you in implementation of the policies. You might consider hiring, for example, a chief EDI officer, someone whose role is going to be to take action, follow up, coordinate messaging with stakeholders, and really take the lead on these initiatives. And having an EDI officer really sends a clear message to your employees about the importance of the company, that the company places on the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Lastly, if you're going to hire a chief EDI officer, make sure the person has sufficient authority and resources to actually carry out their mission. Policies need to be updated. So policies can't remain static. They have to evolve with the company and take into consideration workplace incidents, for example, which can reveal specific gaps in the existing framework. You should also get employee feedback. Naya touched on this earlier. Often policies are enacted without actually looking at the issues that need to be resolved. So getting feedback from your employees and tailoring your policies accordingly is a best practice to adopt. And like we said, this is a journey. So it's more than likely that there are going to be tweaks and revisions along the way. So be sure to keep your policies updated regularly. We all know that actions speak louder than words. So of course, apply your policies, but also ensure that they're accompanied by consistent actions by leadership, messages that show that EDI is part of the company's core values. So leadership plan follow-ups, hold town hall meetings, for example, about progress, take accountability for that progress, and demonstrate their actual commitment to act in accordance with the programs that are being enacted. And of course, policies are one thing, and they're a great start, but generally they can be inefficient to actually drive actual change. So an EDI program will yield much better results if it combines policies and effective training. So let's move from the basics to the specifics and discuss some examples of best practices you should consider in terms of EDI policies. So a great place to start is, of course, by reviewing recruitment and talent management processes. Evidence has shown that many hiring, selection, and career mobility processes actually operate in a way that can unintentionally increase bias. For example, recruiters have a tendency to only advertise jobs to a narrow range of potential candidates, or perhaps reach out to only certain schools or universities, thus excluding other candidates. Hiring managers have a tendency to use selection criteria that don't necessarily relate to job performance. For example, automatically ranking employee referrals higher than other candidates. Managers also have a tendency to give high visibility work only to in-group team members and promotions to those who actually know somebody. So there's a tendency to prefer those in the inner circle above other candidates without regard to objective criteria. Evidence has also shown that people of color, unfortunately, are too often overlooked for client-facing revenue-generating jobs that can lead to C-suite roles. So employers should address these biases by reviewing recruitment and talent management policies to identify any barriers to equitable, diverse, and inclusive recruitment and talent management, and then act. Identify what the leaders, the managers, and the recruiters can stop, should change, or redesign in the procedures they're applying. So let's look at some tips for recruitment processes to ensure EDI in the process. Now, in terms of best practices, you should be offering accommodations to candidates. And we have an upcoming session dealing with reasonable accommodations in an EDI context. So I invite you all to take a look and join that session. And so I won't go into too much detail about accommodations, but you must know that as employers, we have a legal obligation to provide reasonable accommodations so that we can ensure that people are treated fairly and equitably, notwithstanding protected characteristics set out in human rights legislation. Candidates should be supported with accommodations during the hiring process, and there should be a policy in place that sets out the accommodation process. That should also be stated on the company website, ideally, and you should consider including it in your job postings. When you meet or speak with candidates to invite them for an interview, offer accommodations if needed. And consider, instead of asking a candidate what they need, tell them what you can offer. So reduce the burden on an applicant to know what they need or what they can ask for, and instead do the work in advance. So know what your company can or cannot offer and have a set of examples of what you can do to accommodate a person during that process. Now, training and support for employees who are involved in hiring is crucial. And this is actually one of the most common needs that's expressed by hiring managers when they're asked what they need to pursue the work of diversifying their teams. And you won't be surprised to hear that it's also the most common request that candidates from underrepresented groups say they would like to see happen in organizations. It's also clear that the more that managers and recruiters are exposed to diversity and encouraged to account for their hiring and promotion decisions, the more likely they will be to address potential issues of unconscious bias. So training for hiring processes and hiring managers can include topics such as anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-discrimination, accessibility training, unconscious biases. And we'll speak a little bit about that later, namely on enhanced unconscious bias training, because it appears that traditional UB training has proven ineffective. It's also important to make sure that everybody who might potentially participate in the recruitment process is exposed to the training. So if managers are trained, but everyone else isn't, there's likely going to be a disconnect between messaging and actions, and that's going to be perceived by candidates. A best practice to explore in recruitment is also to use anonymous recruitment, which essentially involves removing identifying details from candidates' applications. So generally we'll remove or redact information such as names, name of educational institutions, languages that denote gender, countries, locations. And the goal here is to mitigate unconscious biases in the hiring team. And this has actually been shown to lower implicit bias and increase chance for a more diverse shortlist pool. It's also important to create an objective and consistent system for screening applications. So create a rubric. Use the job description to establish set benchmarks and values for shortlisting before you review applications. And then consider whether the rubric might favor one type of individual or one type of experience, and then see how you can adjust it to make sure that your process is more inclusive. Now, if you want to have diversity in your organization and you want to have diverse recruitment, it's important to have diversity on the hiring committee. So having staff members from different backgrounds join the hiring committee can offer different and unique perspectives to the hiring table. This can also help you flag questions that might create barriers for equity-seeking candidates. And having EDI, having diversity on the committee is fine and dandy, but it's going to be useless if you don't recognize the added value of diverse voices and perspectives, and if you don't create safe and open environments for these voices during the interview preps and the debrief meetings. In terms of best practices, we generally recommend to be consistent with interview questions and also with the way that you assess responses. So for example, establish benchmarks for assessing interview questions and assign values or weights to those questions. You can draw from a bank of interview questions and then use the same set for all candidates. And as an explicit part of the debriefing process, there should be an honest and open discussion between committee members about implicit bias. A good tip is also to avoid discussing the interview and your assessment until everyone has completed their own evaluation. Obviously, discussions between those who've already finished have a tendency to sway those who are still assessing and still deliberating. You should also be prepared to ask and to answer EDI competency questions. So if the company is committed to EDI and you want to add team members who are aligned with these values and that mission, you should include EDI-related questions in your interview. So you should be prepared to answer the same questions on behalf of your organization and be prepared to answer how you can support the candidate in gaining or growing EDI competency in their work. So for example, be prepared if a candidate asks you how your organization applies principles of EDI in the workplace. How do you prioritize EDI? How will you support the candidate in applying EDI to their work in the organization? And a good tip when asking EDI questions is to be clear and honest about what you're looking for. Often EDI questions as to their wording and their intent can be vague and somewhat confusing. And at times, the question might even seem to imply that you're asking the candidate to identify themselves as part of a marginalized group or to make a case as to why EDI matters to those groups. So you should test your EDI questions, read them out loud, and maybe get someone to give you feedback on them. Now, recruitment is only part of the process. Now you need to onboard and essentially retain diverse talent through different initiatives. So let's look at some of the best practices you can enact in this regard, starting with mentorship. So the company should support mentorship by and between equity-seeking employees. You should allow time for these employees to actually participate in formal mentorship programs and encourage them to participate in informal mentoring relationships. You should also consider compensating and rewarding leaders who are mentoring and supporting internal staff. So this can take the form, for example, of an allocation so that they can go have coffee with their mentee. And allocating resources for mentorship is an investment in the team. An equity-seeking employee should feel supported by their organization to do this work. Now, if you're going to reward leaders for this work, you should also reward employees for their EDI work. So employees from underrepresented groups will often take part in EDI initiatives, in part because it resonates with them and because they're often asked for their representation and their voice. But too often, this means additional responsibility and tasks being added to an existing workload. So the work is very important and it's meant to be transformational for the organization. So compensate staff for this added work, provide time, give them resources so that the work doesn't become something that's done on the side of the desk. If you want to retain your employees, create career development plans that address their needs. Work to understand their career aspirations and the skills that they need to acquire them, and consider pairing employees from underrepresented groups with mentors or sponsors who can provide guidance that can support them, advocate for them in their career development. You can also provide training programs for leaders and managers to increase their awareness of diversity and inclusion issues and develop inclusive leadership skills. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. Offering training and development opportunities can address specific needs and career aspirations of diverse employee groups. So you should talk to your employees directly and get a sense of their ambitions, their goals, and shape the training programs accordingly. We also recommend supporting participation with affinity groups. So the company can encourage the formation of employee resource or affinity groups that are based on promoting diversity and inclusion. These groups generally act as a forum for employees so that they can discuss EDI-related topics, share best practices, and organize events and initiatives, or even act as a solidarity group for underrepresented communities within the workforce. Now, of course, you need to foster a safe space and an inclusive workplace culture, one that recognizes different voices, that accepts various ways of participating or engaging in situations, and accepts people as their authentic selves. And this is a long-term process, so employers need to understand that culture change takes time and intention, and they have to be prepared to commit to the process to yield results. Now, a few practical considerations to touch on if you want to establish a workplace where people from all backgrounds can feel they are able to thrive and belong, starting with regular communications. We should be incorporating messages about diversity and inclusion into regular communications, newsletters, for example, internal memos, team meetings. And you can use these opportunities to actually reinforce the company's values and highlight initiatives that actually promote EDI. But also be clear about expectations with employees as to what an inclusive culture means, and be sure to set the tone by emphasizing and clearly communicating how important it is. Employers should also provide different ways for employees to give their feedback regarding their own experiences in the organization. For example, consider employee engagement surveys or activities, have open discussions or one-on-one conversations about employee experiences. And asking for feedback will allow for continuous improvement with thoughtful follow-up action plans. Now, to yield best results, This type of bottoms-up approach should also be combined with the top-down commitment that Naya was mentioning earlier. We need to have an engagement and a commitment from leadership to the principles of EDI if we want the program to work. It's also helpful to bring different people together to work collaboratively and encourage development of interpersonal relationships that are based on understanding and trust. You can also help connect with employees by using appropriate personal communications, being transparent and authentic, signaling to others that it's okay to be their whole selves. And this favors a relationship of trust, which can include an open dialogue. So let's look at some examples of EDI policies that incorporate best practices in the workplace. And just as a general comment, there is, of course, no one-size-fits-all type of approach when it comes to EDI. So companies should enact policies that will address the specific needs identified within the organization. Good examples of best practices include having inclusive language and communication. Companies should promote the use of inclusive language in all their communications, starting with job postings, internal communications, as well as external messaging. And the policy should include training and guidelines to educate employees on the importance of using language that is respectful and inclusive of others. And we're going to see some examples of this shortly when we discuss pronoun policies as part of creating an inclusive workplace for trans and non-binary employees. Employers can enact policies regarding accessibility and accommodations. So ensure that workplace facilities, technologies, and communication channels are actually accessible to candidates and employees with disabilities. Employers can also offer inclusive benefits and wellness programs. So offer benefit and wellness programs that address the needs of diverse employees. For example, parental policies, mental health resources, and accommodations for religious observance of and holidays. This will send a message to employees about the company's commitment, and a comprehensive and flexible wellness program will allow for greater EDI and appeals to a greater talent pool. Policies can be enacted to ensure that performance evaluation and feedback incorporates the principles of EDI. So implement fair and objective performance evaluation processes that are free from bias and discrimination, and provide regular feedback and coaching to support employees with their professional growth. Training on these topics can include the things or tools to overcome unconscious performance appraisal biases. These can include, for example, recency bias, which is the tendency to recall one's most recent interaction with a person and then just focus on that instead of other historical interactions. Proximity bias, which is the tendency to believe those you physically see and work with are actually working harder than employees that are off-site. Proximity bias can greatly disadvantage and actually warp the perception of remote or hybrid employees' contribution. And the tendency, unfortunately, as you can imagine, is on the rise since the pandemic and the increase in remote and hybrid working environments. Another one is the idiosyncratic rater bias, which essentially occurs when a reviewer will place more weight on skills that they themselves are not skilled at, and then lower weight on skills that they are good at. And the last example, gender bias, where men and masculine presenting individuals tend to be judged on their behaviors and accomplishments. Women and feminine presenting individuals are more likely to be judged by their managers based on their personalities and attitudes. So to minimize the effect of these type of biases, it's important to take a structured, to make or use structured feedback and to formalize criteria to assess employees. Now, we already touched a bit on professional development and advancement, so I'll move to a zero tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment. And this should be a given. Companies have to have a workplace prevention policy dealing with harassment, discrimination, and violence. But the policy should also enact a zero tolerance to such instances. So the policy should prohibit discrimination and harassment based on protected characteristics, and it should identify examples of inappropriate conduct. It should also outline a procedure for reporting and investigating complaints and specify what the consequences will be for violations. And just as a reminder, you should check with your local requirements in terms of the content that has to be included in these policies, because they can vary from province to province. Companies should also consider having a statement regarding their company culture and engagement. So creating a policy that will firmly codify an inclusive company culture that welcomes diverse perspectives and encourages open and respectful discussions. So these policies want to create opportunities for employee engagement and collaboration during the process, and they should take into account the specific needs for improvement that were identified in the organization through feedback and measurements. So in such a short session, it's going to be impossible to go through the myriad of best practices we could recommend. So we selected some examples which merit discussions in light of increasing reports of discrimination against the trans community. So as a note, for the sake of this presentation, I might use the term trans as an umbrella concept, which includes non-binary and gender non-conforming individuals. So why is creating a workplace that is inclusive of trans employees important? Well, for most of us, work is stressful in and of itself. But imagine carrying the emotional weight of having to deny and suppress a fundamental aspect of who you are, your gender identity, just because it doesn't comply or conform with society's norms regarding gender expression. Now, even worse, imagine you have the courage to come out at work to finally reveal your authentic self, only to be ostracized by your colleagues, to be rejected or ignored. Surveys have shown, and different surveys actually conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality in the US of more than 27,000 trans persons revealed that over 77% of those who held a job in the year prior had to take steps to avoid mistreatment at work, hiding their gender identity, delaying their gender transitions, refraining from asking employers to use their correct pronouns, or even quitting their jobs. So, although there is growing awareness as to the challenges faced by the trans community, employers remain ill-equipped to actually address the situation through proper policies and culture changes. So here are some best practices that you can adopt to achieve that. Start with basic policies that are inclusive of trans people. Think about bathroom access, for example. An important way that you can signal to your trans employees that they are valued is to either institute gender-neutral bathrooms or encourage trans employees to use bathrooms that align with their gender identity. And then you need to educate employees with EDI training on the importance of actually being accepting and welcoming if they're in the company bathroom with a trans coworker. Also think about your dress codes. Make sure that any dress codes that you might have are inclusive of trans people. So employers can help destigmatize varying expressions of gender by making explicit to all employees that they can select from a range of gender-neutral options. And these type of policies actually have been shown to aid in recruitment and retention by signaling to the workforce that normativity is not expected. Another basic policy that should be adopted is pronoun and name usage. Research has shown that misgendering of trans employees, whether intentional or unintentional, is a relatively common occurrence at work, unfortunately. So employers can signal to their trans and non-binary employees that they're valued by paying actual and serious attention to their correct names and their pronouns. So we can address this in a number of ways. Keep records, for example, of employees' chosen names and pronouns. Ensure that appropriate terms are used when you have personnel or administrative processes, directives, email addresses, business cards, websites, and also encourage employees to either use name badges or email signatures that can include their desired names and their correct pronouns. This will be a way to enable people to learn those names and pronouns and also cultivate awareness of the varying gender identities that their colleagues might possess. It should be noted that this should generally be done on a voluntary basis. So we don't want to force people to identify their pronouns and perhaps risk outing somebody who is not ready yet. So this generally is more effective when you proceed on a voluntary basis through encouraging messaging, through encouraging awareness and taking a commitment. Another way is to support gender transitions. Transitioning is not a single event. It's literally a process that stems from a deeply personal decision, usually resulting from years of soul searching. And coming out at work can be complicated and scary. So employers should develop a comprehensive approach to manage gender transition, one that focuses on the employee, but also on cultivating a work environment that's conducive to that process. Think about, for example, helping transitioning employees who elect medical procedures by offering access to healthcare benefits that are gender identity specific. This can vastly reduce the stress and anxiety of coming out at work and sends a highly affirming message to trans employees. And then communicate. Ask your trans employees what they need during their transition and how they would like the process handled. So listen and cooperate with them to ensure that people are not inadvertently outed without permission or before they're ready. And we all know that knowledge is power, so make sure that HR professionals are equipped to provide information about where employees can learn more about treatment options, organizational support groups, or perhaps other available resources to help a transitioning employee manage work-life issues that can arise during the process. Now, leaders and managers should proactively cultivate a supportive work environment. The period of transitioning is particularly sensitive, so individuals fear being ostracized, pressured, namely to support their identities, and this can increase their susceptibility to depression, anxiety, and even through suicidal thinking. Having supportive policies in place is likely to actually remove barriers to care for trans employees, because trans employees and trans people seeking surgeries will likely be questioned by surgical teams regarding the existence of support networks, which are sometimes actually required for those who want to seek gender-conforming procedures. It's also been shown that utilizing interventions to build resiliency can be effective. There is research that supports the idea that trans individuals can benefit from stress management interventions, namely interventions focusing on mindfulness, which is a state of non-judgmental attention to present moment experiences. It's been shown that this can insulate trans employees from emotional exhaustion after having experienced a stigmatizing event at work. And last but not least, develop training that is specific to the needs of your trans and non-binary employees. Corporate diversity trainings still have a lot of room for improvement when it comes to trans and non-binary individuals. So a few tips. Be sure to include contact with those who identify along the trans identity spectrum. There is research on the contact hypothesis, which suggests that providing opportunities to build relationships with specific groups, so to hear their stories, to appreciate their challenges, and gain empathy is actually critical for shifting attitudes and behaviors towards them. You should also, however, remember that it's not the responsibility of members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community to educate others or to be visible in that way. So out trans employees should only be included in trainings if they are voluntary and willing to do so. Otherwise, there are plenty of resources that can be contacted to offer this type of training. It's also important to help cisgender employees develop the skills to become informal champions of their trans colleagues. So people often lack the knowledge and confidence to challenge prejudice, and we're going to see that in just a few minutes regarding bystander intervention. So employers should seek to equip employees, especially the leaders, with concrete strategies for stepping out of their comfort zones and engaging in courageous conversations regarding difficult diversity-related topics. Now, a few comments on best practices in trainings. Now, let's talk about theory versus practice. If you're looking to succeed at delivering any kind of training, you need to be engaging, and EDI training is no different. Studies have shown that effective training is one that focuses on the acquisition of skills rather than mere awareness. And there's also research that suggests that including certain types of exercise in EDI trainings can produce more promising results. For example, perspective taking, which is essentially the process of mentally walking in someone else's shoes, can actually improve pro-diversity attitudes and behavioral intentions towards other groups. And studies have also shown that perspective taking can have crossover effects on EDI. So for example, taking in the perspectives of 2SL LGBTQI plus communities was shown to actually be associated with more positive attitudes and behaviors towards racial minorities and vice versa. Another activity that is important to include in training is goal setting. So evidence has shown that goal setting can be successfully adapted by asking diversity training participants to set specific, measurable, challenging yet attainable goals regarding diversity in the workplace. For example, a trainee could set the goal to challenge inappropriate comments that they hear about marginalized groups when overhearing them in the future. So when you're designing or revising the company's EDI program, remember that tailoring empirically supported exercises and activities to company goals and employee characteristics will help with progress on the journey to making the organization more welcoming and inclusive. Now, people often ask about mandatory versus voluntary training. And although EDI should be a mandatory core value of the company culture, imposing a policy of mandatory EDI training has been shown to actually have the opposite of the intended effect. So it can lessen employee engagement. Feelings can arise that create defensiveness in reaction to being forced to take a training that might not be perceived as necessary. In other words, mandatory EDI trainings don't answer the question of what's in it for me. So one way to address this is to have clear and consistent messaging that outlines the importance of EDI training and what its intentions are. Asking your employees to participate in EDI training as a means of supporting their coworkers is far more effective than making them feel like they're being punished or scrutinized, because this will tend to generate a defensive reaction where employees put up their guard as a self-protection mechanism. So by answering what's in it for them, you're delivering the message that your company encourages open communication and positive team dynamics. You should also include drip training as part of the EDI program. When delivering a training, you're essentially telling a story, and great stories don't come together all at once. They're built bit by bit, leading up to a conclusion. And the same can be applied in EDI training, where regular content is released over a period of time, with topics building upon one another, leading to takeaways for employees. We talked earlier about the importance of regular communications about EDI, and this is part of drip training. So drip feeding is about time delivery. Employees receive information in stages, progressively gaining access to content like lessons, quizzes, assignments. And drip content is a great addition to traditional training sessions because it involves bite-sized content that's easy to process. So consider planning throughout the year scheduled company-wide emails that will highlight diversity events, raise awareness among employees, and promote open discussions. Now, drip feeding is also a great way to enhance employee engagement in EDI training because it includes consistent messaging by the company about core values, and it promotes discussions in the workplace on diversity-related topics. Now, when coming up with trainings and developing or revising them, consider organizational context and involve your managers. Organizations are complex. They have different internal logics, they have different cultures and different dynamics. So it doesn't really make sense to take a one-size-fits-all training or policy and then just graft it onto a different organization. The context actually matters, and it should be accounted for when deciding how you want to increase EDI. So often, one of the contextual elements that is generally overlooked is getting managers and other leaders involved from the start. So often organizations will have experts come in and they will design programs that are then deployed to the managers, but the strategy often lacks a reality check because it doesn't take into account whether the program fits into the way that managers already work or whether it's actually adding a burden or adding new requirements to an already complex workload. So involving your managers in the design process can increase their buy-in and smooth implementation, and it can also make interventions more sustainable and long-lasting. Now, lastly, executive leadership should be EDI champions. Effective EDI programs will involve messaging from the top about the importance of the program and the commitment to the journey. So there has to be that top-down commitment. Hiring a chief EDI officer, like we discussed earlier, is one way to send a clear signal. But the CEO or the president of your company needs to take a public stance. They should embed EDI in the organization's purpose, exemplify the culture, and take responsibility for progress towards goals. So a few examples on best practices for training. We touched on this briefly earlier, the importance of unconscious bias training. And research has actually shown that UB training has been proven to be ineffective in terms of actually changing the way people address their biases, mainly because it focuses on awareness but lacks methods and skills being provided to people to actually manage their biases and change the outcome of their behavior. So the most effective UB trainings will do more than just increase awareness. They will actually teach strategies to manage behavior and track progress. So you want to provide information that will contradict stereotypes, then allow employees to connect with people whose experiences are different from theirs. And this will assist in developing empathy and understanding. Now, I see time is moving quickly, so I'm going to streamline through to the next example. Bystander intervention training, an excellent training to offer as part of an EDI program. This is a training where we equip people to deal with situations that they're witnessing that are unjust. For example, bias, microaggressions, and other non-inclusive behavior. So bystanders or bystanding occurs when a witness to an incident makes an active decision not to intervene, and in some cases goes as far as to directly enable discriminatory situations. Upstanding, on the other hand, is when someone recognizes that an act is unjust and then interferes using bystander intervention techniques. So to effectively promote EDI in the workplace, employers should train their employees on how to intervene, how to put an end to situations that are inappropriate in the workplace. Now, other topics that can be included, and I won't go into a lot of detail here because of the timing, but inclusive leadership. This is a must-have. If you want to send a proper message, you need to make sure that leadership is leading by example. You can also consider cultural sensitivity or competency training. This is going to help equip employees with the skills they need to react in the workplace appropriately and to actually have open and frank discussions with people from other groups. Training on intersectionality, which is the intersection of different identities and how those can create either privilege or discrimination, and then recognizing and dealing with microaggressions. So without further ado, I'll pass it along to my colleague, Shane.
Thanks, TK. There's a lot of great content there. Of course, we could keep talking for a very long time, and I'm mindful we're approaching 1 p.m. So we're going to streamline this next session to try to get people out on time, but also leave a little bit of your borrowed time for Q&A. So bear with us for the next 10 minutes or so, and we'll get to some of your questions. A lot of great examples of policies and trainings in that section. I want to say that policies and trainings should be part of a larger EDI plan, and that plan should guide your action. You don't just have to say, oh, I think we need this type of policy. Oh, we need that type of policy, and then just implement them in the workplace. What you need to do is set some goals and priorities, outline how you're going to get there, and measure your progress towards those things. It can start with something as basic as a vision statement from your chief executive or your chief EDI officer, and from there, scanning to see what you already have in place at the organization, setting some priorities about where you want to be in your future state, and then identifying some indicators that you're going to use to measure your progress. And who's going to take ownership? Who's going to be accountable for ensuring that these things are done? Once you've got a plan, and I know that sounds daunting, and it is a lot of work, but once you have a plan, your plan will identify the policies and the trainings that you need. So you're going to start putting pen to paper. What do you need to think of when you're drafting a policy? Well, the basics are on the screen for you here. You need to have a purpose. What is it you intend to do here? Who does your policy apply to? When does it start? What's the statement of our policy? What are we doing? We're intending to hire more diverse individuals. We're intending to have 75% of our applicant pool be from diverse backgrounds, whatever your policy is. Your policy should set out who it is in the organization that has responsibilities or obligations to fulfill these things. And then it should outline what happens if there's instances of non-compliance, who owns your policy, who approves it, and sets timelines for review and implementation. And both Naya and TK have talked about this as we've gone through the presentation. Your policies should be reviewed as often as necessary. So if you have an incident, there's a breach of a policy, that's when it's necessary. But you should also review them at a set timeline. So if nothing happens, you have a set timeline review. That can be something that you choose yourself if it's not prescribed by legislation. And be careful there, because some timelines are set by legislation. So if you're touching on a health and safety policy, for example, there's usually a 1-year review policy review obligation rather. Thinking also about the training. Once you've developed your policy, you've written it down, you've got it the way you want it, you're going to have to operationalize that. You're going to need to socialize it in your organization, communicate it to staff, employees, and managers. Depending on the nature of the policy, you may actually do training. And the basics for training are on the screen here. Think about who you're going to select as a trainer. They need to be someone who's either by education or experience competent to train on that topic. Not everyone can train on every topic, and I think we need to recognize that. If you have someone who's not competent to train on the policy, you can send them for training themselves. Train your trainer. Have them get up to speed so that they can do the training you need them to do. Think about what the learning objectives are. Do you just want people to understand what this objective is, what this policy's objectives are? Or are you intending that people should be able to cite line and verse from the policy? What are your objectives? What are you going to evaluate people on? From there, you can develop your training content. And people love slides, people love PowerPoints, people love putting people in rooms for an hour while you talk at them, but that's not always the best way to train, as TK has talked about. You could do some practical training. You could do role playing, particularly for bystander training and intervention training. That could be a very impactful training. At the end of whatever training you've decided to implement, you'll want some method of testing retention. And I say that for 2 reasons. 1, because you want to make sure people are paying attention. And 2, it gives you a record of training. Because I know that TK came to class, I know that TK did the test, and he got 100% on the EDI training. And I keep that in his file. And keeping and maintaining records of training, as Naya has talked about, can be very important in litigation, where someone alleges, hey, I didn't know we had a workplace harassment policy, or I didn't know there was an anti-violence policy in the workplace. Well, you can say, well, here's the test you wrote on December 3rd of 2023, obviously knew that there was this policy. Like policies, trainings need to be reviewed as often as necessary, and that means when something happens that indicates their need to review it, an incident in the workplace, you review your training, you update it if necessary. If nothing happens, you should set a timeline where there's an automatic review of your training. That can be a year, that can be 2 years, depending on if there's any legislation that prescribes the timeline. Those are sort of the basics in policy and training development. There are some not so basic things that you need to think about as well. There can be legal requirements to consult on the development and implementation of policies and training. So look at your collective agreement if you're unionized. look at legislation, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Canada Labour Code, look at your other contracts to see if there are obligations for you to consult. Some collective agreements, your union will have negotiated an obligation for you to consult with them prior to implementing policies or trainings. In the legislative sphere, some employers are required to consult on training and development in certain areas, for example, health and safety. If you're a federally regulated employer and you're touching a health and safety policy, often you're required to consult with your policy committee or your workplace committee or your health and safety representative. Similarly, if, for example, you're a provincially regulated healthcare employer, the regulations require you to consult with your joint health and safety committee on the development, establishment, and implementation of health and safety policies. So think about what type of policies are we touching here? What sort of legal obligations do we have to consult before we make these changes and before we implement training? Even if you have no legal obligation to consult, there are some instances where we think it's advisable that you do so. If you have a policy that is impacting or tending to advance equity-seeking groups, it's a bad idea to implement one of those without any consultation with that community. Now, I'm not saying go out and find the one gay person in your organization. That's me in your organization, and I'm not the only gay person here. But for example, find that one gay person and say, hey, here's our policy on being gay in the workplace. Tell me what you think. That's a burden on a person who is potentially marginalized in the workplace and not necessarily something you want to do. But look for other ways to consult. If you have affinity groups like TK talked about, you could take the policy to the affinity group and say, hey, we're looking at implementing this policy. We'd appreciate some community feedback if you feel like you can. You can also look at external community resources like gay rights advocacy organizations and see what they advise on these sorts of policies. In any case, before you implement your training or your policy, make sure whatever you're about to implement is consistent with your legal obligations. And I say that in particular to our unionized employers on the phone. Look at your collective agreement, make sure there's nothing inconsistent, particularly if you're implementing a policy, nothing inconsistent with the collective agreement. Once you've got your consultation done, you've got your policies and training developed, you need a process to roll it out. You have to have a strategy to communicate the policy to all of your employees and your stakeholders. Particularly to employees, it's going to be important, and particularly if you're unionized and at some point you may discipline someone under that policy. Because whether you're unionized or not, if you end up in front of a judge or an arbitrator, the judge is going to say to you, show me that you demonstrated to this employee that there was a new policy. Show me that you told this employee that they can be subject to discipline. And you're going to need to be able to do that if you want to prove your case. You also have to set some timelines and targets to hold yourself accountable for the implementation, and consider as you're setting those timelines and targets, like I want to have 100% trained by December 31st, consider the effective date you've set your policy. If it's Jan 1, then maybe you do need to have all your timelines done and your training at 100% by December 31. But if you have more time, you could phase it in. We want to have 25% by June. We want to have 25% by September, and so on. Once you have your policies and procedures developed and you feel like you're ready to implement them, and you do implement them, it's not a set it and forget it exercise. And we've talked a lot about that. And some of you will remember the Ronco food dehydrator infomercials where they talked about setting and forgetting it. I'm looking at Naya and TK and they're both wondering what I'm talking about, but there's a famous infomercial saying set it and forget it. Now I feel old. Moving on, it's not a set it and forget it exercise. You need to continuously evaluate your policies and procedures. You're not done once you've implemented them. It has to be part of a continuous process. There needs to be continuous improvement. One way to look at that is to set indicators that you're going to look at to measure the efficacy of your policies and your training. And what you're going to look at is really going to depend on what your policy is about and what your larger framework for EDI speaks to. So if you're looking, for example, to develop an inclusive hiring policy and your framework sets targets for representation in your applicant pool, maybe you're looking at current and year-over-year diversity in your applicant. Maybe you're looking at the number of diverse candidates who were hired into the new employee pool. If your policy is about the retention and advancement of members of equity-seeking groups, maybe you're looking at your workforce survey, your current one and year over year. Maybe you're looking at your termination and resignation statistics by designated group. Maybe you're looking at your promotion stats by designated group. There's lots of other examples depending on the policy and your objective. The point is, you cannot just set the policy and hope it will be effective. You do actually need to check, and you need to set some indicators that you're going to look at to measure your progress towards your goals. And it is very much a continuous process. I'd be remiss as a lawyer if I didn't tell you that you've got some workplace conflict indicators that could indicate EDI issues. You've got internal and external complaints that are being filed. They could reveal individual or systemic issues not being addressed by a current policy or training. And generally, you can use the anonymized allegations in that complaint to identify gaps. And I want to preface that by saying there's a few caveats. It does need to be truly anonymized. If you've got personal information or personal health information, privacy legislation in some provinces may restrict your ability to use that information without notice or consent. If you're dealing with a complaint that's been filed under legislation, there may also be restrictions on your ability to use it. For example, in Ontario, if they filed a workplace harassment complaint, information you gather in the course of the investigation can only be used for the investigation, for taking corrective action, or as required by law, and that may not allow you to use it more broadly. Similarly, your collective agreement might limit your ability to use certain information, so take a look at what your collective agreement says about that. Think also about where and when you got the information. If you were in the process of settling a complaint or a legal proceeding and you got information about a gap in a policy or a procedure, might be covered by settlement privilege or another type of privilege that could restrict your ability to use that. Think also about civil claims. If you've been sued in court, those anonymized allegations are a good source of information about potential gaps in policies and in training. Be careful about what you're using. The anonymized allegations, again, should be fine to use to identify a gap. You can't use evidence that you gather in the course of the discovery process under litigation. That's usually subject to what we call a deemed undertaking rule, which means what you learned, what that evidence you gathered in this litigation process, you can't just use it for any other purpose. You can only use it for the litigation process. And then, of course, human rights complaints, they're going to be bang on examples of how people felt that things did not go in a way that was appropriate in the workplace, considering their protected status. And so they will be a good example or a good source of information about potential gaps and opportunities for you in training and policy. And even if you don't believe any of the allegations in the complaint, those anonymized allegations can be used to do some checking, to just say, hey, you're saying you didn't receive any training on this, or that sounds like that person wasn't trained on this policy. It's an opportunity for you to do some checking to make sure that things are going the way that you think they should. But again, before you do that, you need to look at the legislation and the tribunal rules. They could contain restrictions on the use of information. You'll see, for example, one here from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal on the screen saying you can't use documents or evidence you gather in the course of the proceeding for other purposes. Keep in mind also that tribunals have the power to issue confidentiality orders, and so things that you learn in the course of the process may need to be kept confidential. My final point is really just to emphasize that evaluating is a process, that EDI is a journey, and it's not a checkbox. It's better to view this as a continuous improvement cycle. You plan to do something, you do it, you implement it, you check it, and then you act to address any issues. And that remains true for the rest of your entire EDI framework. The goal is to begin to slowly but continuously improve and hone your EDI practices to improve your employees' experience and ultimately corporate performance. With that, I'm going to jump right into Q&A. Naya, do you want to come off mute, and TK come off mute and join me for Q&A?
Great. So we'll try to do this as quickly as we can. We got a lot of questions, but we'll only be able to get to a couple. There were some questions about accommodations and pay transparency that you can attend the upcoming webinars that we have on those topics to get more insight onto those. But the first question, and I'll give this one to you, Shane, is How can an employer avoid EDI policies and programs being merely a check the box exercise?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the point I just made, is don't just set it and forget it. Don't set a policy and a program and say, okay, we're done. Make it a process, have a goal of continuous improvement, find some ways to weave it into the fabric of your organization and of your culture. Have events to celebrate cultural holidays, celebrate Diwali, celebrate Eid. Do some drip training year round, small pieces of information about a community that's in your workplace that people may not understand. Tie EDI to compensation, incentivize leaders to make it a priority. Don't just bucket it as something that lives in the chief EDI officer's house and isn't anywhere else in the organization. Have it at every table, in every conversation. It's part of compensation, it's part of performance, it's part of advancement, it's part of discipline, it's part of the framework that we view workplace issues through. So I say when you take those sort of steps, you're not going to have it be a checkbox exercise. It's going to be something that you live and breathe every day.
The next question we have here is EDI going away? And how can we adapt this trend and ensure that that EDI is still an important part of workplace and society culture? So this one is an interesting question. We got a couple of questions like this. And the thing to know is that your organization's EDI efforts, they do not depend on the political climate or whether there's a trend for other workplaces to kind of go towards or away from EDI policies. You have certain legal obligations in Canada that require you to provide a workplace free of discrimination. As we reviewed, there are requirements across jurisdictions for you to be doing this. And if your organization is taking the approach of other organizations aren't leaning into EDI, so why should we? Ultimately, it's going to be bad for your bottom line. Like, you are going to be the organizations dealing with, complaints in various forums. You're dealing with workplace investigations and spending time, energy, money dealing with the implications of not having the appropriate policies and trainings in place to prevent these sorts of situations. Okay, so the next question we have here is, what are the best practices for performance management in light of EDI principles? And TK, I'll ask you to answer that one.
Thank you, Naya. Well, obviously, in terms of performance management, you need to make sure that the values of EDI are transposed to your processes. You want to make sure that you have clear and inclusive goals, objectives that align with EDI. You want to make sure that your performance goals reflect your commitment to diversity and inclusion. And there should be collaborative goal setting. So involve employees in setting their own objectives, which will promote ownership and inclusivity. Ensure that evaluators are trained on unconscious biases and trained to apply standardized evaluation criteria. And make sure that you use a holistic approach to evaluation that's going to include multiple perspectives. I would say also ensure fair access to development opportunities. So we talked earlier about development programs and career development policies. Make sure that you identify skill gaps and then provide equitable access to training and development programs for everyone. That can include mentorship, sponsorship, various types of training. But the idea is to make sure that you're setting your employees up for success.
Great. Thanks, TK. We've come to the end of our time today, so I'd like to thank both our audience and my fellow speakers for being here today. For those of you who are in Ontario and Quebec, the CPD certificate QR code is on your screen, and there's a link in the chat. If you don't get a chance to use the link, the certificates will be sent next week. For our BC viewers, the Law Society of BC title has been added to the chat as well. For those of you in BC, I assume you know what that means. The final webinar in our 4-part EDI series is October 30th, and it's on the topic of accommodation and bona fide occupational requirements meeting the threshold. The link for this session has been added to the chat, and we really hope you can join us. If you'd like to register for any of our events or watch replays of prior events, please visit the Paskin Institute section of paskin.com. Thank you again so much for coming today, and have a great day, everyone.